Hi, this is Ina, in with you in the fight back, and today I want to talk about Gracchus Babeuf and the conspiracy of equals. Now, for those of you who don't know, Gracchus Babeuf is probably considered the first modern communist, and he emerged out of the French Revolution after he came to prominence after the fall of Robespierre and the Jacobins during the Thermidorian reaction. Now, Babeuf has been kind of a historical interest of mine for several months now, so I've read a great deal upon it about him. And there's a lot of misconceptions or accepted narratives about him that he was some kind of utopian dreamer, for one, or that he is a precursor of the later Blankist tradition of the militant elitist minority who were going to rule on behalf of the people, totally divorced from the people. And I think I can say, although there is slight truth in each of those views of Babeuf, that by and large they are not true. And we do know that in 1789, the French Revolution begins. There's a constitutional monarchy at first, and eventually a republic. Along this time, there's increased radicalization as the old feudal nobility is overthrown, as peasants seize land, as the as the urban population engages in all sorts of action against the old regime. And this increased radicalization of the French Revolution will eventually lead to the downfall of the monarchy and the Jacobins rising to power in the midst of counter-revolutionary uprisings and war from abroad when all of Europe declares war. And the Jacobins transgress in many respects what we would consider bourgeois norms to preserve a bourgeois revolution. For instance, they engage in economic centralization. They have a maximum in prices for essential goods, and they engage in requisitions, and of course there's the terror. Now, I just want to say a caveat. Babeuf was involved in a lot of the peasant uprising in his own home province. He started as pretty much someone who was finding out what feudal lords what their how much money they're expected to get from their tenants, and he was interested in social problems. He wanted to know how people could achieve true or common happiness, true happiness, and he believed the property was a problem, and he wanted a redistribution of land. So he was engaged in agitation with peasants in Picardy over taxes, and and during this he's able to use a newspaper effectively. He becomes a champion of the populace, and he's able to link these particular tax problems to larger general problems of social inequality. Now he's elected to various offices during this time, and he's a lot of enemies among the local nobility, the elites, and he's eventually chased out. He ends up in Paris, and he works with the Jacobins. So he's in the midst of this, and he sees the condition of the urban populace who are suffering from shortages, inflation, and at times almost starving during the revolution. Now, after the Jacobins are overthrown, after Robespierre is killed, and the Thermidorians come in, Babeuf had been in prison for part of this, and he's eventually released. And he launches a savage attack on the Thermidorians and the Directory, which is the new government. Now, the Directory is it's pushing back a lot of the popular reforms, a lot of the popular provision. It actually repeals the Jacobin Constitution, which Babeuf will uphold, and it limits the franchise. It essentially shuts down a lot of the popular societies. Now, Babeuf is criticizing the Thermidorians. He ends up in prison several times as a result of this. Now, I just want to say that, of course, we should uphold what the Jacobins and Robespierre did is absolutely just and right, but recognizing that they did not go far enough. That they still, even though they limited private property, they enshrined it in a constitution. Even as they looked at an ideal of small peasant proprietorship, a republic of virtue, as opposed to attacking the root causes of social inequality. So that's to say, Babeuf wanted to go farther than they did. And while he's in prison at one point for agitating for popular societies, greater democracy, social equality, it's here that he's really able to forge, in the prison of Arras, I think, he's able to forge, I think, communism as a practical program. He's able to see that it's not about holding up the present society to some ideal, but to see that communism is a practical goal. It's a horizon that opens up possibilities that can be struggled for, that can be achieved. And after he's released from prison, he essentially organizes a secret directorate, an insurrectionary committee it's not just a bunch of communists, although there are communists in it. There are Jacobins, there are other left-wing radicals from the overthrown Jacobin era, and they're all converging around Babeuf and his co-thinkers, who are animated by this ideal. And as Babeuf says, we need to give the Republican polity new life. We need a new truth to animate it, and that truth is communism. He calls it the common happiness, but everyone, recognizes it as communism. So Babeuf does, essentially they realize that the Thermidorians are completely corrupt. They're cutting back popular reforms, and they're enshrining inequality, privilege. They want to be a regime of law and order as it is. So Babeuf, he forms this organization, the Conspiracy of Equals, as it's later called. It's kind of a misnomer, and it's conceived as an organization that will seize political power. Unlike later utopian socialists who are trying to appeal to the elite to enact reforms, Babeuf is declaring war. And as opposed to the later Blanquists, who are an elite, militant minority and conspiracy, Babeuf's organization does not make conspiracy a principle. In fact, it's because open political organizing by the left is so suppressed in France at this point that he has to go underground, and then he has to engage in clandestine activity, because every time he does, his newspapers are broken, etc., etc. So this is a practical necessity. It has to be done. But it isn't just so you may think, well, doesn't that mean he still has a conspiracy? Well, no, because Babeuf's whole method of operation is about getting people involved. From 1795, 1796, their organization has links throughout Paris, the provinces. There are Jacobins, there are other left-wing radicals, and they are moving to achieve what we would later call it a proto-version of the dictatorship of the proletariat. A dictatorship that will put down the resistance to the old regime and give way to full communism, common happiness. But they're always striving to involve the populace in them. They have a military wing that's agitating among soldiers. They're procuring arms. They're agitating in the streets, putting up posters. They're in taverns. They have songs. And they are planning essentially a major blow, one big strike at the state. At one point, Babeuf had even considered a version of rural guerrilla warfare, which a Republican vendetta, which would have been like proto-Maoist, and it's kind of interesting. But he didn't pursue it. It was directed an urban uprising. But all the time, Babeuf, his organizations in the capital, it was about involving the people, always about getting them involved in whatever agitation they're doing. So this is really exciting, but ultimate. And at one point, there's actually a mutiny among the police legion. In fact, the conspirators had agents among them. And this was the opportunity for them to seize power. Unfortunately, there was a moment of indecision, and the mutiny was put down, and they weren't able to win over those troops. And by the time, right before they were planning to launch their insurrection, was they called it the Day of the People, that would inaugurate communism, they were betrayed by a police informant. And so Babeuf and many co-conspirators are arrested. There's some attempts by those who remain to continue agitation in the streets, and there are women involved as well who are also, Babeuf looks upon women as equals, but it's all eventually put down. Babeuf is put on trial. He gives a very eloquent speech as a closing argument, but he's ultimately executed for treason against the French state, which is putting all forms of radicalism behind it. And Babeuf is executed in 1797, and afterwards, it seems like he would just die out, like this whole idea. But Babeuf, one of his co-conspirators, about 30 years later, writes a book detailing the conspiracy. Or even though conspiracy wasn't really what they're involved in, that's kind of what they were charged with. But anyway, and this kind of gives birth later, and it becomes a huge bestseller in France during the July monarchy, and it influences the later Blankist tradition. It's really not quite influential on Marx, but one can see the linkages with Babeuf to later thinkers. I mean, Babeuf, like Marx, wanted to engage in a political struggle. So he wasn't appealing to the ruling classes, he wants to bring them down. And he has one of his newspapers is actually called the Tribune of the People. Now, this also is looking back to earlier Roman periods, but it's also interesting to note that Lenin says the social democratic ideal is actually the Tribune of the People. So that's very intriguing. And another thing that's very interesting is Babeuf in looking at how democratic demands are intermingled with socialist demands in a revolution, in a sense prefigures Leon Trotsky and the theory of permanent revolution. Kind of my speculation on that. And even just his consideration on rural guerrilla warfare, and his later look in his earlier work among peasants kind of shows almost what I call a Maoist tinge. And there are many books such as on Marxist.org. Belford Bax wrote a biography of Babeuf. It's about 100 years old. There's Gracchus Babeuf, the First Revolutionary Communist by Rose. I forget the first name, but it's really good. Ian Burchill wrote a book. I haven't read it, but I've kind of read some articles by him, and he's kind of looking along the lines I am. But in many ways, Babeuf is not just a precursor of Marx in certain political attitudes, but of Lenin in how his organization seemed to prefigure a revolutionary political party, not an elite, but a mass party that is striving to connect with the masses and to hasten the downfall of capitalist rule. It could be argued that it was premature, but I think, based on everything I know research about Babeuf, that I think the conspiracy could have actually succeeded, at least in Paris, and I think even in its failure, even if the moment wasn't right, it prepared the way for later struggles that would be successful, whether we're talking about the Russian Revolution, the Chinese, or the Cuban, or whatever. And in a sense, like, by engaging in that struggle, those ripples have continued to carry on throughout history. And I'm just fascinated by this figure who, even in a time when supposedly it wasn't right, was willing to go the distance for the revolution. So this is Ina. Until next time.